Nigeria's economy is on the move and the signals are coming from every sector. Ambitious growth targets, careful monetary guidance, renewed support for farmers, and falling fee prices. Hello and welcome to MarketSquare, your go-to show for deep insights into business and economic trends. I'm Olaitan Adebayo, and today we are diving into key developments across Nigeria. Stay with us. Welcome back to MarketSquare. Nigeria's trillion-dollar ambition is running into a familiar obstacle. Reforms that stabilize the books but fail to move the real economy. That's a central warning from the latest economic insight released by the Bashir Adeniyi Center for International Trade and Investment, which argues that despite the government's aggressive macroeconomic adjustments, exchange rate unification, subsidies withdrawal, and renewed trade facilitation pushes, the reforms have not translated into the productivity and industrial depth required to power a trillion-dollar economy by 2030. The report captures a growing concern among trade and economic experts who gathered at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. Revenue is improving, but the real economy is not keeping pace. Manufacturing output remains weak, export capacity is still thin, and industrialization, the engine that could lift the economy towards the trillion-dollar mark, has not taken off. Nigeria posted 3.4% growth in 2024, better than population growth, but productivity gains are still missing. With average inflation at 26%, even modest gains are being eroded before they reach households or businesses. The alliance is leaning heavily on global development theory. Micro-stability alone cannot deliver structural transformation. Countries only leap forward when stable reforms are paired with productive investments, technology absorption, and institutional coherence, the very thing Nigeria struggles to align. Trade facilitation shows these contradictions clearly. Customs' new platform has improved transparency and boosted revenue, but goods are still take 19 days to clear. Nigerian ports almost triple the time in Ghana and 4 times longer than Morocco. Congestion, weak coordination among agencies, and poor infrastructure continue to swallow whatever efficiency gains should have produced. It reinforces the point: reforms without supporting system cannot accelerate growth. The report also paints a stark picture of Nigeria's external position. GDP measured in dollars collapsed from $668 billion in 2019 to $252 billion in 2024, before recovering slightly to $285 billion in 2025. Much of that decline came from currency adjustment, higher inflation, and subsidy reforms, painful corrections, but necessary to reset long-term resilience. Yet the structural weakness dragging the economy, multiple taxation, chronically insufficient electricity, and policy inconsistency remain unaddressed. And the export numbers underline the fragility. Crude oil still accounts for 52.9% of exports. Manufactured goods are just 1.4%. Even agricultural exports sit below 10%. Without a rapid shift into high-value manufacturing and services, the trillion-dollar target cannot stand. Foreign investment mirrors the same imbalance. Foreign direct investment plunged from $3.31 billion in 2021 to $1.08 billion in 2024. By comparison, South Africa and Egypt are drawing in multiples of Nigeria's number. The report notes that over 80% of impact investment in Nigeria come from foreign direct investment, while domestic investors contribute barely 5%, a direct sign of a confidence deficit. Where the country shows promises at the subnational level, investors increasingly respond not to the federal environmental but to specific states, and the center highlights how Lagos, Ogun, Rivers, and Kano are becoming economic centers in their own right. Lagos remains the standout, nearly 30% of national GDP and over 70% of non-oil exports, powered by relatively consistent policy decisions and investor-friendly public-private partnerships. The report suggests that replicating Lagos' model could accelerate national competitiveness far more quickly than federal-level reforms alone. Nigeria has laid the foundations for stability, but stability has limits. To move from stabilizing an economy to growing one, reforms must translate into productivity, factories operating at scale, exports rising beyond raw materials, ports functioning efficiently, and a policy environment that signals coherence rather than contradictions. Until then, the trillion-dollar ambition remains aspirational rather than achievable. From Nigerians' broad economic reforms and the trillion-dollar ambition, attention now turns to monetary policy, where Fitch urged the CBN to ease rates cautiously in 2026. Fitch Ratings' latest sub-Saharan African sovereign outlook delivers a clear message to Nigeria. The era of monetary easing has started, but the road ahead is narrow and unforgiving. For a country emerging from 2 years of painful reforms, the call for caution is not just technical advice. It is a warning that the wrong moves could quickly reverse fragile gains. Nigeria's inflation has begun to slow, creating the room to ease interest rates after months of aggressive tightening. But Fitch argues that the Central Bank of Nigeria must navigate this phase with precision. Rate cuts that inject too much liquidity could reignite price pressures, weaken the naira, and erode the confidence the bank has been trying to rebuild. This is especially critical because rate decisions are not abstract events. They touch real life. Borrowing costs determine how expensive it is for businesses to expand, how much households pay on loans, and how far salaries stretch in the market. After inflation eroded purchasing power for 2 straight years, Nigerians are just beginning to feel marginal relief. A mismanaged easing cycle could easily take the country back to double-digit strain. Across the region, other monetary authorities are also stepping into the easing cycle. Kenya and Ghana are expected to cut rates further. South Africa's new inflation target provides even more room for adjustments. But the difference is structural resilience. Nigeria's financial system is now grappling with elevated inflation, high debt service costs, and a banking sector heavily exposed to sovereign debt. That exposure means any wrong monetary moves rippled into the banks, driving up risks and constraining lending. Fitch maintains a neutral outlook for sub-Saharan African sovereigns heading in 2026, citing moderate inflation, stable growth, and improved refinancing conditions. External markets have reopened for low-rated African borrowers, easing debt rollover risks. But the agency warns that rising youth activism and upcoming elections could delay fiscal tightening, and Nigeria is firmly in this bracket, with national elections slated for early 2027. The broader regional picture shows steady improvements. Median GDP growth projected at 4.3%, inflation trending down to 4%, and debt to GDP ratios expected to fall slightly. Commodity prices will also help. Brent crude is projected at $63 per barrel in 2026, while improved cocoa output in West Africa will support revenues. But the worry is whether Nigeria can convert these tailwinds into stability. Fitch notes that while governments are working to improve revenue and reduce waste, political pressures could slow implementation, a familiar pattern in Nigeria where reforms momentum often weakens as election cycles approach. This is why the CBN's decision last month to retain the monetary policy rate at 27% is significant. It reflects caution, discipline, and acknowledgement that inflation remains a threat. The bank is trying to consolidate gains before shifting direction, a move investors generally reward with confidence. Lower inflation could bring some ease to the cost of living. Gradual rate cuts could eventually reduce borrowing costs for SMEs, mortgage seekers, and manufacturers. But if easing comes too quickly, the naira could slip, prices could rise again, and the fragile stability built over the last 18 months could collapse. The next phase of monetary policy would determine whether Nigeria sustains disinflation, stabilizes the currency, and positions the economy for real growth, or slips back into volatility just as recovery is within reach. In a country where every market decision affects food prices, transportation, salaries, and business survival, Fitch caution is not theoretical. It's a reminder that achieving stability is hard work, but losing it takes only one wrong policy step. Beyond monetary guidance, the CBN is taking direct action to stimulate growth by pushing banks to increasing lending to agricultural sector. The Central Bank of Nigeria's renewed push to raise agricultural lending above the current levels of less than 5% of banks' credit signals a structural shift in how the financial system treats the sector. Governor Olayemi Cardozo remarks at the inauguration of the new Agricultural Credit Guarantee Scheme Fund Board underscored the CBN's attempt to correct what it sees as decades of underfinancing that have slowed food output and starved smallholder farmers of capital. Cardozo frames the moment as a break from business as usual, arguing that agriculture, despite contributing more than 1/5 of GDP to GDP and employing most Nigerians, still attracts a small amount of bank credit. For the Apex Bank, that credit gap remains one of the biggest drags on productivity, mechanization, and long-term food stability. The fund, which guarantees up to 75% of agricultural loans, is being positioned as the main instrument to unlock lending at scale. The CBN points to 2019 amendment that expanded the scheme's capital from 3 billion naira to 50 billion naira and widened its mandate. With the new board now including farmers' representative, the intention is to give producers a direct voice in shaping lending priorities, a deliberate move towards inclusivity. This renewed push aligns with the federal government's renewed hope agenda, which places agricultural reforms at the center of its food security strategy. The emphasis is clear. Smallholders, who constitute 80% of Nigerians' farmer and produce close to 90% of its food, can no longer remain locked out of credit simply because they lack collateral or a bankable history. But a more revealing angle emerges from the realities in rural communities, the real heart of Nigeria's food system. In these villages, the credit problem sits alongside deeper structural gaps. Most of the farmers feeding the country operate in remote areas where banking access is limited, extension services are weak, and post-harvest losses remain high. Even when they manage to raise capital informally, they lack the storage and processing capacity needed to preserve value, meaning a significant share of their produce never reaches the market at full worth. This is the gap policymakers are now confronting: a food system heavily dependent on vulnerable small producers who sustain the nation without the infrastructure or financial support required to keep them productive. The latest policy suggests a push towards deeper rural inclusion and a more deliberate effort to channel credit into productive agriculture. The real test, however, will be whether banks, even with guarantees, are willing to adjust their risk appetite and whether the restructured scheme can translate policy ambition into measurable improvements in food output, farmer income, and rural livelihoods. At its core, the message from the new board is that Nigeria's agriculture challenge is rooted in these grassroots realities. The country relies on farmers operating in some of the weakest points of the value chain, and until credit storage and market access are deliberately extended to them, agricultural transformation will remain a promise rather than a breakthrough. And while farmers stand to benefit from greater credit access, consumers are feeling relief at the pumps as Dangote Refinery output and a stronger naira bring petrol prices down. Nigerians' recent drop in petrol prices is more than a temporary relief at the pump. It signals structural shift in the country's downstream petroleum sector. Several factors have converged to ease the cost of premium motor spirits for consumers, but the dynamics reveals deeper implications for domestic refinery, currency stability, and supply chain resilience. At the center of the shift is the Dangote Refinery, whose growing output has steadily altered market dynamics. Since beginning partial operation, the refinery has consistently lowered prices, demonstrating the tangible impact of large-scale domestic production on consumer costs. With the pledge to supply 1.5 billion liters of petroleum monthly starting December, Dangote's position in Nigeria to gradually reduce dependency on imports, which historically left the country exposed to the global price swings and currency fluctuations. The strengthening of the naira has amplified the effect of increased local refinery. As the dollar weakens against the naira, import prices ease, translating to lower landed costs for petroleum products. This combination of higher domestic supply and improved currency stability has not only brought down retail prices but also reduced smuggling incentive, though cross-border arbitrage remains a persistent challenge due to regional price disparities. Supply chains improvement further reinforce this positive trend. Independent marketers now enjoy more reliable access to products, and government assurance of sufficient supply have stabilized distribution networks, minimizing panic buying. Longer operating hours and more confident pricing decisions indicate that confidence is returning to a market that has often suffered from scarcity-induced volatility. Yet, the human dimension of this development is just as important. Lower petroleum prices immediately reduce transportation and logistics costs for households and businesses, impacting everything from commuting expenses to the pricing of goods. For small-scale traders, farmers, and service holders who rely heavily on road transportation, the savings can translate into more affordable goods, improved margins, and even potential reinvestment into their businesses. Smuggling remains a shadow factor, with Nigerian petroleum priced at roughly half the cost of that in neighboring countries. Border enforcement and legal export channels become critical. Initiatives such as Operation Wherewith and legal export by Dangote aim to redirect demand away from the black market, supporting both government revenues and long-term market stability. The recent price reduction reflects more than tactical adjustments, the market structural recalibration of Nigeria's fuel sector. If domestic refining scales as planned and currency and supply chain stability are maintained, consumers and business can enjoy sustained relief. Meanwhile, the government and private sector have an opportunity to deepen market confidence, reduce illicit trade, and ensure that lower prices contribute to broader economic gains rather than temporary fluctuations. Nigerians are witnessing a market transformation where strategic investment, improved currency management, and coordinated supply efforts are beginning to reshape affordability and accessibility in the downstream oil sector. The coming months will determine whether this new equilibrium holds and whether domestic refinery can fully offset the vulnerabilities that once made the country dependent on imported petrol. From the challenges of turning the reforms into tangible growth to cautious monetary moves and renewed support for agriculture and the relief at the petrol prices, the forces shaping Nigeria's economy are coming into focus. This is where we wrap up today's episode. I'm Olaitan Adebayo and this is MarketSquare. Follow us across all our social media platforms and thank you for watching.